Thank you, Emma. Dr. Marie Orton received a BA in Humanities from BYU in 1989. She then went on to receive a master's degree and a PhD in Italian, both from the University of Chicago. She taught at Duke University and at Truman State University prior to joining the faculty at BYU in 2016, where she currently serves as professor of Italian. She is also a faculty affiliate of European Studies and of Global Women's Studies, and has performed remarkable service in the College of Humanities and across BYU campus. She is the recipient of many awards and has focused her scholarship on Italian cinema, on social issues in Italy, on cultural transformation, and has translated quite a wide range of books from Italian into English. She focuses on topics such as decolonization, and thus is a great fit for us this semester in our lecture series on legacies of colonialism. She is the co-editor of two books, Contemporary Italian Diversity in Critical and Fictional Narratives, and Multicultural Literature in Contemporary Italy. She is interested in Jewish men and women from Italy who survived the Shoah, and some of the stories that they have told about their experience being Jewish in Italy, and is recently very interested in migration and in the way in which people come to Italy from a wide variety of places, and the way they encounter Italy, the way they make sense of their new surroundings, and the way others make sense of them. Professor Orton has many, many fans. She's a remarkable teacher. She teaches Italian language, Italian civilization, and culture. And those of you who have been in one of her classes know what a special person she is. We're so delighted to hear from her today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marie Orton.
Wow, thank you everybody so much for being here, and thank you, Quinn, for that very generous introduction. It is a tremendous honor for me to be here and to be invited to speak at the Kennedy Center, and I'm very grateful to be considered both a scholar and a disciple of Jesus Christ. This invitation also gives me the chance to thank everybody at the Kennedy Center for the enormous positive influence and the opportunities that your work brings to our students, and especially for how much you have blessed my academic and my personal life and enriched both. I also am especially grateful for the Kennedy Center ethos of exploring our world as we wrestle with difficult global issues within a gospel perspective. My task today is to explain how the gospel relates to my research, which concentrates, as Professor Meekum said, particularly on migrations in the context of Italy. My main claim is that human migrations, no matter what kind, whether they're voluntary, whether they're forced displacement, such as deportations, whether it's for economic reasons or immediate survival, such as refugees fleeing war, all human migrations are typically recorded in statistical terms, charted in economic terms, debated in political terms, but the issues surrounding migration are lived and registered in human and cultural terms. Those issues include personal and national identities, cultural change, equity or inequity, discrimination, belonging, and I'd like to give some context about how I arrived at this area of study. As Dr. Meekum explained, I did my PhD in language and literature, Italian language and literature, at the University of Chicago. And those of you who know the south side of Chicago are aware that it's a checkerboard. There are neighborhoods of great privilege that sit right next to neighborhoods that are impoverished and dangerous. That economic disparity was only one of the many disparities I saw all around me. The obvious gaps between the haves and the have-nots in terms of education, access to healthcare, safety, everything. And I struggled with how to deal with these disparities. What were the solutions? And what could I do about them? At the same time, I was studying Italian culture and was drawn to autobiography. How did writers create a public identity? How did they navigate those tensions between personal history, history with the little h, and collective history, history with the big H? Identity construction is so often seen as an affirmation of the rugged individual, especially in the United States. In American culture, we have this culture that values that people should forge their own path. But to do that makes a lot of assumptions. And what I studied and saw all around me in Chicago made it obvious that people are much more formed by where and when they live, by their circumstances, often unjust, usually beyond their control. And I found myself asking, how did those tensions between the individual and the collective play out in terms of self-definition? And during the same time, I was called in my ward to work with the young women. There were 22 young women in our ward, and 20 of them lived in the housing projects, and there were similar numbers of the young men. The very first Sunday that we met together, all together, young women, come on in. It's SD, she needs to be here. Okay. One of the first things I noticed when we had our first discussion together, the topic was, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I noticed that the young men did not say, when I grow up. They all said, if I grow up. They lived in violent neighborhoods. They had all lost relatives or friends to gang violence. The average life expectancy for an African American man at the time was 25 years, and it was a daily reality to them that they might not see adulthood. This altered my perspective of my past and my future. In my academic studies, I started looking at how life experiences that included violence altered the autobiographer's relationship with their very identity, and how the identities they constructed were marked and sometimes even defined by that violence. I went to Italy on a Fulbright research grant, and I just have to give a shout out to Stan Benfeld because he probably does not remember, but I will never forget, he helped me with my application. I think about it every year when I read our applicants for Fulbrights. In Italy, I interviewed individuals who had written autobiographies centered on inscriptions of violence, Italian Auschwitz survivors, African migrants to Italy, and former members of the terrorist organization, the Red Brigades. My decision to focus on how violence marginalized people and on how being marginalized is reinforced by violence did nothing to reassure the people in my life about my academic pursuits. After learning what I studied, the reaction of most people everywhere was to back away slowly because they were convinced somehow that my interest in violence and autobiography was somehow autobiographical for me. And once I was even asked in an academic interview, a job interview, so can you just clarify how you feel about violence? Like, do you like it? Is it good or bad? And when I responded that I believed violence is always dehumanizing, I was unprepared for the interviewer to go on and say, I quote, maybe you need to go and consider the more positive uses of violence. So yeah, that comment alarmed me so much I took up long distance running to kind of process it. But what that comment also showed me was how dangerous and how human it can be when we see other people's trials or traumas or difficulties as merely an instructive lesson for us because we approach them with such distance. That interviewer was not the only one who has expressed concern about my research interests, especially early on in my career. I was frequently called upon, let's not say to explain so much as to justify my academic choices, most often by relatives. I have one auntie in particular who would say to me every time she saw me so wistfully, "You were always such a bright child. Why did you want to get a PhD? And why in Italian, just so you can study sad things?" These relatives, who all love me, wanted some kind of reassurance that what I did was worthwhile. And all the reasons I gave them so willingly, so enthusiastically, failed to calm their concerns. So now that I'm older and okay, mostly older, when a colleague or a cousin asks me why I dedicate so much time to study and energy to study migration and the violence that surrounds it, I tell them a consecrated life will never be a wasted life. What follows is my attempt to explain how studying migration is an act of consecration, and I use that term consecration in its widest form. The idea that we are dedicating our everything completely, our hearts, our words, our resources, our actions, everything we dedicate to God. Among the things I typically examine in texts and films produced by or about migrants are the complexities of individual and national identity, the construction of inside and outside. Who or what decides this? What are the ramifications? What are the attitudes and policies regarding belonging? Who gets written into the dominant narrative and the official story? And who gets written out? Perhaps most crucially, who's going to have access to resources and who is not? Working on issues of migration has led me to become involved very frequently with translation. It has been my blessing and my privilege to get to know and work with many authors, most who have lived their own stories of migration. And English translation means dramatically increasing the reach of their writings. It's also seen as a legitimization of their work. People, okay, again, mostly relatives, have been known to ask me, okay, but what does working in the humanities really do? Does it have any real-life applications? And one of the immediate examples I often point to is the fact that in recent years, the writing of these authors, I'm showing 4 here who have become all bestsellers, they have become included in the Italian school curriculum. These authors have. Their writings have also been featured in the terrifying Maturita, the final national exam that every high school student has to take to get out of high school. And as I say, these are 4 who've achieved best-selling status. These writers and dozens of others were studied by scholars outside of Italy for years before scholars inside of Italy even acknowledged their existence, much less their work. And that external interest has been fundamental to the inclusion of these writers in the incredibly traditional, and I would even say closed, Italian canon of literature. Not unlike how the international and the critical interest for the Italian neorealist film movement validated it long before it was accepted in Italy or recognized and helped facilitate that legitimization. In my translation work, here are just some of them. I learned quickly that effective translation has to be a collaboration. And though that collaboration can be extremely intense sometimes, to me, it's the most valuable and meaningful aspect of the job. Millicent Marcus, most of you who know her would know her work in film studies, has written that the mandate of translation is evident in the root meaning of the word. It comes from the Latin traslatio, which means to carry over or to carry across. This does not involve necessarily just carrying words from one context to another, but carrying meaning. And, she contends even more importantly, carrying the audience. That is the translator's true task, to carry the audience across the distance that separates cultures and languages, usually by offering the audience a different and wider perspective. As with my translation work, it has been fundamental to me to approach my critical scholarship about literature and film as a form of collaboration. When I'm analyzing authors' work, I do everything in my power to meet those authors in person, talk about their work, and if they wish, and they almost always do, I send my finished article to them or chapter. These are just some of the authors that I've worked with and interviewed. They're such remarkable people. I just want to explain a few of them. It's the work of a few of them. The second person from the top, Jazim Hadari, is from Albania, and he was the first, to date, he's the only migrant author who has received the Everest of Italian literary prizes, the Montale Prize. In 1997, he received it for poetry. The person just below him, Nasera Chora, was the first Italian African migrant to write first woman to write an autobiography. The person just to the left of her, Randa Ghazi, when she was 15, she published a book called Dreaming of Palestine. I don't like the term runaway bestseller because it seems You know, it's kind of hackneyed as a term, but it really was. Within a year, it went through 16 translations into different languages, and ultimate form of legitimization, it was almost banned in France. So it was a really important work. They have all been so generous to me to work together, to grant me interviews, to be interested in my work. The person just to the right of Nacera, Ana de Caldas Brito, is from Brazil. She has started a foundation that hosts writers' workshop for all writers, especially young writers, especially people who might be from a disadvantaged background, and she offers them stipends. She comes from a very privileged background, a diplomatic background, and she feels it is her mandate to help encourage other writers. So many. Okay, at the very bottom on the extreme left is Gabriela Curvilla. She's also an artist. We've collaborated on several projects. She did the artwork for one of the edited volumes I did of a special edition. And it gets personal for me, how much these people have helped me in my work and allowed me to participate in theirs. But also sometimes it's just becoming really good friends with people. The second time we were working on something, she said, I was living in Italy at the time with my family, and she said, look, your daughter's about the age of my son. They were both about 5 at the time. She said, why don't you just bring them? I mean, just bring her, and they'll play in the park, and we can talk. We tried that, and of course now they needed to have a snack. So we go back to her house, where my daughter decided to teach her son how wonderful permanent markers were. And so we left our mark in all kinds of ways. I could go on and on about all the people here. The last person I'll mention is at the very top, third over, is Fatima Ahmed, who's a very dear friend. I think her situation and her story exemplifies the legacy of one of the legacies of colonialism, specifically the diaspora. She's from Somalia. Her family fled, but couldn't bring all of the children. She was one of the youngest. They fled to Cambodia because of more problems there. Their family fled, but she didn't follow them. She went to Italy because she had health problems, and a Catholic foundation helped pay for her treatment. So she spent her young adulthood and the rest of her life in Italy, married, had children. One of her sisters joined her there. So in this family of 6 children, they all speak Somali and Arabic, but none of their children speak the same languages, and none of them can communicate with their cousins. Also, her children then migrated to the UK, and so she said her grandchildren don't speak Arabic or Somali or Italian well enough for her writings to be something they can understand. So for a gift, she asked me if I would translate an autobiography she wrote for them, it was a very moving kind of collaboration for me. I could talk about this all day, but I will move on. Excuse me. What did I want to say? It can be daunting to interview authors, especially when you're asking them about their traumatic experiences and when they call into question your critical approach. In fact, I meant to say about Nacera Chora, her book had been published for 7 years by the time I interviewed her, and she had had a lot of negative experiences with journalists and students who wanted to interview her. She wasn't accepting interviews anymore. She said the only reason she let me was because my PhD advisor was a close personal friend. And she said her experience with other people had been, I quote, they just want to use your pain to advance their own careers. And she trusted I would not do that because I was one of Graciela's students. This tension, as I say, that this burden that comes when you're interviewing somebody about these kinds of issues is something that became instantly clear the very first time I ever interviewed an Italian Holocaust survivor, Shoah survivor. This is the first person I interviewed, Giuliana Tedeschi. The first thing she asked me was why my study would not exclusively deal only with Shoah survivors. She felt that including her testimony alongside other groups who had also suffered violence was a form of demeaning the suffering of the group she associated with, and it denied the exceptional status of the Shoah. In her eyes, I was dishonoring the suffering of those who had perished in Auschwitz. That's how he started. I respect and I agree with the opinion that every individual story and every group is unique. And I also believe that understanding a text's context is absolutely essential to understanding the text itself. And I appreciate that if you are not part of a group that you choose to study, that distance can impact, often negatively, the authenticity of your own viewpoint, as well as your authority as an interpreter or an advocate. At the same time, I also feel it's very important not to view elements of history or culture as if they only belong to one person or are owned by one group. Culture and history are the responsibility and the burden of all of us. They belong to us all. Or more to the point, I feel we cannot afford to consider someone else's story as less important than our own. Juliana Tedeschi's concerns, along with the interview she gave me, became central to my study. Every interpretation or representation of another's experience inevitably partakes in the very distance it seeks to bridge, just as all translation, in any attempt to carry over, inevitably confirms the gulf between us. And it is incumbent on every scholar, every student, to take eternal care that one's distance does not become an operative of hierarchy or dismissal. Similar concerns about representation were voiced by many of the other authors I've worked with. They want to know how I intend to use their work. How are students going to approach their texts? How much context in class will the students get and understand about what's happening in Italy relative to different migrations? What prejudices will my students bring, and how will I deal with those? Do my students have some essentialized view? Do they assume every migrant writer is somehow typical, interchangeable, that every writer is some part of the huddled masses yearning to breathe free? This is one of the authors I've worked with over time, and when I interviewed her, Laila Wadia, the first thing she said to me was, "Don't call me a migrant and don't call me an author." She's a professor of literature at the University of Venice, and she considers writing to serve as a mirror for culture as well as a bridge between them. One of the most meaningful ways I strive to deal with these writers' valid concerns is to make sure that my students have direct personal contact with them. Authors have generously visited my classes by Zoom. They've corresponded with my students. Especially if my students are writing an extensive research paper about their work. Our class is designed to help students become educated about the authors and their circumstances, but knowing that they will meet the writer in person is intensely motivating to students. And I have been so gratified to see our students do everything they could to understand and prepare themselves to converse intelligently with these writers. And I still thank the Kennedy Center again for co-sponsoring Kosi Komalev Eberi's visit here the year before last. He was one of the bestseller writers that I had up earlier. When it comes to migration studies, I often refer to Italy as the canary in the coal mine. Whatever the issue is, the status of the status of the children of migrants, their civil status, citizenship, the mass arrival of refugees from war in Syria, the Chinese government colluding with companies to export and to exploit workers, the rise of right-wing governments demonizing migrants in order to achieve political dominance. Whatever the issue about migration, it will happen in Italy first, almost always, and the effects will be immediately evident. With its over 3,000 miles of coastline jutting out into the Mediterranean, for centuries, Italy has always been a crossroads and for migrations, and it still is, because approximately 85% of refugees and migrants who enter Europe come through Italy or its coastlines. Italy serves as a dramatic test case for the entire gamut of issues that come with human migration. In Italy, the cultural inclusion and the civil rights of the children born to migrant parents is just one example of how current laws are inadequate to deal with our demographic realities. As in many countries, citizenship in Italy is inherited, meaning that children born in Italy to migrant parents are not Italian citizens, though they may grow up in Italy and that is their home. They're often referred to as the generazione due, which means the second generation, or G2s. These individuals are only allowed to apply for citizenship at age 18. They have a very narrow window to do so. They then have to wait 10 years, during which time they have to prove continual residence, which means don't change apartments between the ages of 18 and 29. Don't change apartments, but the bureaucratic complexities and inconsistencies provide so obstructionist that the 1.5 million G2 adults in Italy, of them, just over half ever achieve citizenship. The African-Italian documentary filmmaker Fred Cuornu, pictured here, made his second film, 18 Solis, about the frustrations and the difficulties that G2 adults face, young adults waiting in that 10-year period or longer. This film interviews and it interweaves the stories and the social contributions of G2 young adults with the stories and contributions of African Italians during World War II in Italy. They include the story of an African Italian resistance fighter, Giorgio Marincola, and an African Italian world-class boxer, Leone Iacovacci, both of whose stories have been written out of official historical narratives. All of his documentaries examine the problematics of how otherness is represented, especially in the media, and how national identity gets constructed. Who gets to be Italian? Who gets included in official history? By what criteria? And who gets to decide? These are the questions that Fred deals with all the time. Also, so that you have it on your mental calendars, my colleague and friend Dan Paul in our department is organizing a visit from Fred Cuornu in March. So stay tuned, you can meet him. Given the myriad of complex issues surrounding migration, very often it is the case that people will ask me, okay, what's the bottom line? I mean, what's the answer? What's the takeaway? How am I supposed to understand all this? It's also emotionally charged. Do you have an answer for me? And after decades of research, I can say, I would like to offer several. I have several ideas. Indeed. First, let me say, it is counterproductive to view migration only in terms of crisis and threat. Yes, crises prompt migration, but there are many reasons for migration. It is just as much a fact of life as health or the weather. Effective migration policies will be those that treat refugees and migrants as humans with human needs. Attempts to simply end migration will always be based in fear and are doomed to failure. My second thought is, it is dangerous and frequent that we confuse people who have problems with the problems themselves. With refugees and migrants, hostility is sadly more frequently directed at the displaced people when we should have outrage over the conditions responsible for that displacement. Whenever and wherever this view dominates, the view that people who migrate are the problem, effective policy will be impossible. And my third thought is, I have a burning conviction that we matter, that everybody matters, and what we do matters. As Elder Clubbingbat affirmed in his recent campus devotional, it matters. It matters how we talk to and about others, what we laugh at, who we include, who we overlook, because all of those things show who we are. I would add to Elder Clubbingbat's comments that how we discuss and study these issues, how we react to otherness, how we contribute to our communities, how we volunteer, how we vote, it all matters because our culture belongs to and is built by all of us. Migration issues are ultimately human issues. Are we not all of us strangers in a strange land? And these are also Jesus' concerns, which we see clearly in Matthew chapter 25. And I'd like to conclude with some reflections on that chapter, because the considerations in it that draw me to these parables are the same considerations that draw me to study migration. Okay, I love this chapter, and I probably love it because I am a teacher. And as teachers, the question I hear most frequently in my life is this going to be on the final? And may I just say, this is Jesus' answer to that question. He's telling us what's going to be on the final for all of human existence. The chapter it's just 3 parables, right? These 3 parables, the last ones we get in the New Testament. The 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins or maidens, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. And I'm going to kind of skip through. I couldn't get all the parables on one slide, so I'm going to kind of skip through them so you can look at them as I conclude with my thoughts about this chapter. I think all three parables are fundamentally about judgment. The maiden's judgment about how to wait for the bridegroom, or the servant's judgment about how to use the different number of talents that the Lord gave them, or how those in the third story decide how they're going to treat strangers. At the end of each story, we see the bridegroom's or the master's or the king's final judgment of all those people's decisions. And there's a definite crescendo from one parable to the next. In the first story, the unprepared maidens are called unwise, and they are shut out of the wedding festivities. In the second, the servant who buries his talent is called slothful and unprofitable, and he loses his talent. In the third story, those who are separated off to the king's left hand, the goats who did not attend to the needs of others, they're cursed and condemned to eternal punishment. The text doesn't give us any insight into the motivations of the condemned in that third and final parable, as it does with the unprepared maidens. It got late, we fell asleep, we tried to get some oil, sorry, it happens. Or with the slothful servant here. He was afraid of doing it wrong, so he buried his talent. He was trying to save it. It's understandable. Whatever the third group had as motivation, that never gets revealed. Why they held back, we never know. I take this to mean that ultimately, whatever the goat's justification might have been, as far as Jesus is concerned, he doesn't think there is a valid justification. I also think it's important that these three connected parables are situated immediately before the account of Christ's own judgment and his passion. The reader of Matthew is being prepared to understand something about what is most important to the Christ as he squarely faces his own immediate suffering and death, brought about by a miscarriage of judgment in an inverted moral universe. In the final parable of Matthew 25, what distinguishes the sheep and the goats, the blessed and the accursed, is that the blessed saw to the needs of their fellow creatures, and the accursed did not. Neither group saw the full spiritual implications of their actions or inaction. Neither recognized the Lord among the individuals they helped or ignored. The sheep respond to being given the Lord's blessing by surprise and ask, "When did we see you wanting and helped you?" And the goats ask the obverse. The goats ask, "When did we see you and not help you?" Jesus' answer to both groups is essentially the same. He basically says, all the time. Whenever you interacted with your fellow beings, you were interacting with me. Even though the blessed and the accursed ask Jesus a question that's framed in almost identical terms, is it really even the same question? The sheep want to know, when did they get to help Jesus? And the complementary question posed by the goats cannot help but sound like a challenge or an excuse, as if to say, well, since we didn't know it was you, Jesus, we shouldn't be held responsible. There are those who claim that goodness equals weakness, that unselfishness is stupid, that those who are kind are losers, that the communal pot will somehow contain less if we allow the contributions of others to be added to it. But my personal belief is that there is an antidote to this destructive thinking. To deal with the global upheaval in the face of our human inadequacies and limitations, we must rely on consecration. To consecrate means to make sacred, and our efforts are made sacred by our offering them to God, and by God accepting them. We don't just offer our successes to God. We don't just reserve our best to lay on the altar. We put it all on the altar. That's what consecration means. Even the parts we don't like, even the parts we consider unworthy, inadequate. God will decide what is acceptable, and He will make weaknesses become strengths. Consecration will not make our individual or collective problems disappear, but like the concept of translatio, consecration can carry us over and close distances. Truly consecrating can carry us over to a different perspective and close the distance between individuals, between groups, between us and God. When we dedicate our efforts to God, He will do the carrying. We can't close all the distances on our own, but ultimately, He will. Each of us is limited, imperfect, we all fall short, but we can all be disciples because we can all learn. After all, the meaning of being a disciple is to be a follower of a discipline, to be a student. And for me, that's ultimately what it means to be a disciple scholar, to always be a student. And I have to say, again, I'm so grateful to the BYU Kennedy Center for expanding our world and for helping us all be more prepared to serve in that world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a rich conversation you've started with us, Marie. We do have about 15 minutes where we would like to invite you to participate in that conversation. And if you have a question for Professor Orton, just please raise your hand. Adelie in the back is going to come bring you a microphone. We invite you to stand, tell us your name, what you study, or if you're faculty or staff, what you do at the university. And we'll go until just shortly before 1. I'm going to take advantage of the podium for just a moment, though. And as you're thinking, I just wanted to ask one particular question. At the end of Matthew 25, it seems to me that Jesus is teaching us that the way we see each other is not always accurate. And he's trying to teach us to see people in a different way, essentially equating the beggar, the one without clothing or without food, to him. You have spent a lot of time watching movies, reading books, and in particular, translating the work of others. And I'm wondering if you could just say something about the way you end up seeing people differently because you're trying to translate their work or because you're trying to understand the stories that they tell. Thanks.
Well, thanks for starting with a super hard question. I love that. And before I forget, I am shamelessly advertising. This week of BYU International Education Week, as you're thinking about and we're talking about these questions, oh goodness, this happens with me in technology. Did it come up? Good. These are some of the fabulous events that are going on this week for the BYU International Education Week. So you can be planning your life while we have our question and answer. I'm going to answer your question with a story. Kosi Komalaebri, the first author that I talked about, once his books entered the school curriculum, he always made sure his books were only sold by African street vendors. That's how he started from when he first started. After they became part of the school curriculum, he didn't change. You still had to go to a street vendor and ask to get copies of books for classes, because what he wanted was to constrain people, first of all, to actually have a human face-to-face experience, and also he wanted to change that dynamic so that you needed something. You really needed something from these people that often had been seen very differently. I have tremendous respect for this, and he also doesn't take any money for his writings. I would say, how do our interactions change? So much when you are the person who needs something. I need the interview, I need to understand these things. It changes your view, and it also makes you realize how much we all are in, how quickly we can move from a position of needing to thinking we don't need, and how false that is. So I was trying to keep it short. Thank you. Jackson. He studies Italian. He can just shout it out.
Okay, yeah, so my name is Jackson Geary. I'm a Middle East Studies major and Italian double major. And my question is, since we see Italy moving towards a more right-wing government with Giorgia Meloni, whose platform is really kind of based on this opposition to a multicultural Italy.
Absolutely.
In those 2 years since she's been in office, what are some of the realities, both of people who are trying to immigrate to Italy? How are we seeing the possibilities for them change? And also, what are some of the ways that the lives of the G2s are being affected directly by this change in government?
I appreciate that question because it shows how incredibly important policy is. Before Meloni came to power, a law had been passed that allowed those who achieved refugee status to shorten that 10-year residency to get citizenship down to 5, which was really dramatic. Unfortunately, what we also see now is a very chilling effect, which means that not very many people are now being given that status. So doors open and then they get closed by attitudes and everything else. What I find most alarming, though, is the attitude of hostility. And I think that is manifest in thousands of seemingly invisible ways. And I think that becomes very evident in people's writings. When I was working with first-generation writers, a lot of them, especially once they got more established, they started writing a lot of stories using humor and talking about things in kind of a humorous key. You do not see that with Generation 2, G2 writers. There's nothing to laugh about. It's got a lot more hostility in the cultural manifestation. But in terms of policies, yeah, oh my goodness, so much, so many small and more widespread policies that just keep making more obstructionist the possibility to even apply within those few month windows. The other thing you see, I think, really, really frequently is a hostility toward inclusion in representation, or even being able to talk about it. And the pushback is framed in nationalistic terms, which I think is, basically saying we're not America, we don't do that multicultural stuff, which I think is really dangerous on a lot of levels. So, I tried to make it short. Yes, thank you.
So Marie, when you're working with people who are resistant to immigration and who are resistant and who have kind of taken part in this in the uglier narratives and
Are we talking about my family?
Okay, never mind. What works? What have you seen? We all know the times when they make a connection with somebody, and when it's not about policies anymore, it's about the people, and all of a sudden, all the fear disappears out of the room, and there's nothing but love and all of the things that we read about. Where have you seen that happen when people are changed?
I've seen a lot of change. I don't think I've ever seen the utopia you're talking about. I've seen a lot more baby steps. I do see a lot of I have seen fear move. I have seen fear move a lot. And I think in general, I've only seen that happen when people get more educated. Partly it's a personal connection, but also they have to educate themselves and understand the complexity of these issues. Absolutely. I see a huge value to people studying cinema, literature, things that help them understand other people's stories. But there has to at least be that initial step of people wanting to educate themselves about other things and to see their own histories in this narrative. Thank you.
I'm Marissa Marsden, and I'm currently switching my major to European Studies. But I guess, kind of following up on what Professor McFarland was saying, what would be like a couple of simple things that you would recommend for maybe a BYU student to be able to kind of help share what we're learning at this university or that we've learned from past experiences in Italy, kind of take what we've been learning and be able to share it to maybe people in America that haven't seen that and experienced that?
I appreciate that question. First of all, I'd refer back to my third point about how we talk about things, how we discuss them with other people, that we even bring it up, that we're not afraid to have people know that we don't agree with maybe and we're still willing to listen to what their view is. I think it's very important, as I say, that people educate themselves, that they be honestly interested. I will admit, when I was here as an undergrad and international cinema films would come up and they would be described, and I'd think, ooh, that sounds hard. You know what I mean? It takes a real effort to be willing to educate yourself about these kinds of issues. So I would say that willingness and following up on that willingness, getting very informed, and people I have noticed are really happy to talk to me if I listen to them first. Thank you.
James Jeffries, graduate. Could you speak to the disciple scholars, immigrants to Italy, Peter and Paul?
Oh, we have so many stories of migration in our religious texts, right? I mean, Lehi's family, Jesus, President Uchtdorf, so many. Paul, all of his epistles and his voyage are all about learning to striving to get people not to be protectionist about their own view and their own culture, but to say we're all fellow citizens, right? And we're all members in this body of Christ. And I value how those epistles point out how universal human nature is, right? And how hard it is not to become protectionist about our own view and think sharing must mean that I share my view with you and you accept it. We don't always see it as the two-way street that it is. So that's a long conversation that I want to keep having. I saw another hand, but you weren't one of my students, so I don't know your name. Claire is one of my students.
Okay, I was just curious about, have you seen a lot of disparity between like women and men and maybe the opportunities, and like how would you kind of speak to that?
Absolutely. First of all, most women who write their stories come from a position of privilege. Women who don't come up from a position of privilege are not allowed into the narrative enough to get the resources and achieve the cultural capital necessary to be able to tell their stories. Almost always that has been the case. There's some element of privilege that shifts that around. That is the first biggest difference, I would say, that exists in text. The other thing among the G2 generation, what you really see in texts by G2 female authors is how immediately they are and how early, especially depending on their family's origin, how immediately they are sexualized. That by about age 11, that becomes a very important part of how they see their place in this culture, because the culture assumes because of their phenotype, they must be prostitutes or something else, and they are immediately sexualized. So those are the two big differences I see. I know people have to go to class, so is there anybody who wants to ask a final question? Did I say go, and that's the word that everybody hears? Final questions? Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.